Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our book presentation, A People's Guide to the San Francisco Bay Area, with our special guests today, Rachel Brahinsky and LisaRuth Elliott. As you sign in, I will kindly ask you to mute yourself and also turn off your webcam, video cam in case you have it on for recording purposes. But towards the end of the event, you will be able to turn off your video again and ask questions to our presenters. Let me just tell you a little bit about our two guests today. First of all, some of you might be familiar with this book already, and so you have the great pleasure to meet one of the authors of the book and one of the contributors of the book. Some of you instead might not be familiar with this book, so this is a great opportunity to discover something new about San Francisco and hopefully going beyond the most common information and most common image of the city of San Francisco, and learning the people who shape the geography of this city. So our first speaker, Rachel Brahinsky, is an associate professor at the University of San Francisco. She's a geographer and she's affiliated with urban and public affairs, politics, and urban studies. Her research is focused on race, property, and urban change. Instead, many of you are probably already familiar with LisaRuth Elliott. She's one of the co-directors of Shaping San Francisco, which is a really popular nonprofit organization emphasizing on city tours, walks, presentation, bike tours, and she's one of the contributor for this book, and she is really a great expert on the city of San Francisco, like many of us in the San Francisco Tour Guide Guild. So I see that we already have half of the people that registered for the event already logged in, but we are recording the event, so we will be able to share the recording tomorrow to everyone that wasn't able to come today, and also to everyone that belongs to our membership and our friends. So at this point, I will just pass the microphone to Rachel and Lisa. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's great to be here, and looking at the list of names, I don't know most of you, which is really great. So is the sound echoing a little bit, or does it sound okay? Sounds okay?
It sounds okay.
Okay, good. I just heard something funny. Good. Okay, so I am Rachel Brahinsky, and soon you will see LisaRuth Elliott. If you cannot see her right now, my view of the screen is a little different than yours, so I'm not sure what's visible. But I thank you, Roberto, for the introduction, and to you and the Tour Guide Guild for hosting this talk, inviting us here today. I'm sorry we can't be outside on a sidewalk somewhere. Let's do that again sometime in the future. But thanks in general just to all of you for being out there on the video. The presentation that we're going to give you today is based on, as Roberto said, our book that just came out in the fall, in October. It's called A People's Guide to the San Francisco Bay Area, and this is a mock-up of the cover. It's not exactly the cover, but these are the images and colors that are on the cover. And this talk is based on slides that I developed with Alexander Tarr. He and I are kind of co-author and co-editors for this book, and then there are a number of contributors, and I'm going to show you. Excuse me, I'm working out a little technical thing here. There we go. Oops, there we go. Okay, good. So very important to say up front is that this book was produced through the labor and love and care of a whole lot of people. While Alex and I were the co-authors and co-editors, we wrote a large part of the book ourselves, and we edited the rest. And the work that we edited came primarily from these people. There are a number of contributing writers, including the wonderful LisaRuth Elliott, who is here today to share the stage with me. You'll see photographs by Bruce Reinhardt primarily. So any photograph in this presentation that has no name next to it was taken by Bruce. He took most of our contemporary photos. And then if something is historic or shared by a community member or from an archive, more recent archive, then you'll see that it's labeled one way or another. But I like to share this screen first to clarify, sometimes when I talk about this book, I say we, and it's not a royal we, it's not like a weird tick that I have. It's that this really is the product of collective labor. And so it's hard for me to talk about it as an I, even when I'm talking about the parts of the book that I did myself. So I'm going to, very happy to share this work of ours with you today. And let's see. Okay, so before, I'm sorry, I'm working with multiple devices here, and now I'm getting more organized. So I want to start with this collage. So this is a collage of images from the book, one from each chapter, and I'll tell you about the chapters more in a minute, to orient you to the guide and give you a sense of what kind of book it is. It's an unusual book, right? It's a hybrid of styles and ideas. Though it is a guide, it's an academic work, it's peer-reviewed, it's deeply researched. It's built through a series of more than 100 short essays about places, which typically use each place as a starting point for thinking about something larger. For example, the role of public space, or the legacy of a particular activist movement or ethnic group. So through the book, we're offering stories about places while also reaching for that larger meaning, with an emphasis on social justice struggles and on the political and economic tensions that produce those struggles. The essays are short, and they collectively produce a larger narrative about the social and political geography of the region, how it has been produced, and by whom. So it's really important that we're not just naming things that happen and when they happen. We're thinking about these bigger meanings throughout the text, and that's a kind of a big piece of this project. So I think of this as a academic work that's shaped like a guidebook, which means that it's written in a way that we hope will be accessible to a broad public, but it looks a little bit different from other kinds of guidebooks that we are all used to using and seeing. The book is part of a series that comes from UC Press, and it started, the first book was People's Guide to Los Angeles. Geographers Laura Pulido, Laura Barraclough, and Wendy Cheng published that book, and then now they are series editors for the entire project. And People's Guide to Greater Boston came out last year, also in June. Later this year, or very soon in the next year or two, you'll see Orange County, and then New York City, and then others, all produced by collective teams of academics and activists in different parts of the country. So the point here is that we're part of a larger project than just the Bay. The books are not all exactly the same, but there is there's a lot that we have in common, and you'll see the style is quite similar. So today we're going to take you on a little bit of a journey through the book with a little extra emphasis on some of the sites in San Francisco that LisaRuth covered, but we'll dip into our coverage of places all around the Bay. Some of it I will swoosh through really quickly, and some of it I'll kind of spend a little more time on, and LisaRuth will spend a bunch of time on a couple sites in particular. I'll also sprinkle in a couple of quotes from some of the interviews that we did with people on the ground, so you can hear some voices from the field. We have these as sidebars throughout the book, so I'll only share a couple of those, but there's lots more through the book. So the book is structured in 4 main chapters, and they're organized geographically. And this is our chapter overview map. And so you can see chapter 1 is actually the East Bay, not San Francisco, although we'll go to San Francisco first. Chapter 2 is the South Bay and Peninsula. Chapter 3 is San Francisco. Chapter 4, we go up to the North Bay, and we also talk about islands that may or may not be considered North Bay. I can talk about why later if you want to get into the organizational structure of the book. And then we also have a chapter of thematic tours that kind of pieces together themes across the book. And so you can see that we cover the whole region, as I mentioned, and that was a really important political choice for us. We start the book in West Oakland, not because it's hip or transit accessible to San Francisco, as you might have read in the New York Times a couple of years ago, but because in many ways, we see it as one of the historic centers for so much of what we all think of as San Francisco. from intergenerational activism to the painful scars of urban change, from the historic visual culture of Victorian homes to the murals that grow and evolve with the community. I think we can all agree these are kind of pieces of San Francisco that really are important parts of our character, and they're all there in West Oakland. And all told, we argue in the book that West Oakland reflects a kind of spectrum of the Bay Area's culture and politics, its contradictions and its challenges, maybe even its hope for the future. And so it's a place, for example, where mid-century redevelopment devastated the neighborhood, but it's also a place where people responded by building movements calling for self-determination and community control, and that cry echoed around the world. And if you wander around West Oakland, as many of you may know, you'll intersect with the BART train tracks as they swoop from under the San Francisco Bay, shuttling thousands, usually, maybe not these days, but soon again, back and forth to San Francisco and out to the East County suburbs. And in the distance, you can see the cranes of the Port of Oakland, our economic gateway to the world. You'll almost certainly notice tent camps under the freeway overpasses or in the in-between places, or these days spilling out everywhere, where houseless people are seeking shelter. You'll also see shiny homes, often upgraded Victorians with high-end cars that are tucked behind new fences. Oops, someone needs to mute themselves.
Yes.
Or maybe Roberto can mute them for us. I don't know how to do it. So those two things that you'll see in West Oakland, the economic kind of extremes of West Oakland, are really the now ubiquitous poles of the Bay Area's economic extremes. And so we start in Oakland, but Oakland is only one piece of the larger story that this book tells about people and place. From there, we go in all directions, from residential neighborhoods to tech campuses, from office towers to hiking trails. I'll show you a couple of those later. So let's check out a couple more maps to give you the scope of the book, and then we'll get into some of the sites. And so chapter 1, as mentioned, is the East Bay. I'm most likely on whatever screen you're using. You can't see this map that well. It's too small to read everything, but it'll give you a sense, and you can check it out when you get your hands on a copy of the book, which is in the public library. Please buy it or find it in the public library, either way. But they have copies at all of the branches, I believe, or they should soon. So this is the East Bay, and you can see on the left is the list of all of the sites, and then these two maps at different scales zoom in to give you a sense of the kind of breadth of geographic coverage of where we go in the East Bay. And then this is the South Bay. You can see that we're covering a lot of territory, but that in all cases, we do have a density of sites in the urban cores of each part of the bay. And this is San Francisco. We'll come back to this map again in just a minute. And you can see the San Francisco sites clustered in a couple of parts of the city. We actually could have gone so much further. San Francisco, as with every other chapter of the book, actually could have been its own double feature 2-book set. But again, we wanted to think about the region as a whole altogether. And this is the North Bay chapter. You can see that it's a little bit shorter, which is part of why the islands are included, even though some of them are technically in the boundaries of the city of San Francisco. And let me tell you one little story here. So I'm landing on this site to ask and then answer this question. How does this all come together? Why does it all matter? So I like to start with this example. This is an image of a Black Lives Matter demonstration. You might have noticed this as a dot on the East Bay map out in the middle of the Bay Bridge. And you may remember at least the impact of this action. This was a demonstration that strategically stalled traffic on the bridge for several hours. It was Martin Luther King Day about 4 years ago, maybe 5 at this point, to raise attention specifically to the idea that Black health matters. That was their main focus. And we write about this as a site in the book and as just one local example of the methods, tactics, and the spirit of the now global Black Lives Matter movement. So I'm going to leave this on the screen while I talk just a bit more about the big ideas behind the book. What is the theory of this project? So San Francisco has a very progressive reputation, but we argue in this book that the Bay Area is also a place with entrenched injustices, racism, economic violence, homophobia. So this means that the work of understanding what has come before and how people have survived, fought back, reimagined, and dreamed is essential here, but also beyond here. We're not so exceptional. And what this book shows is that from San Jose to Oakland to Petaluma even, people continue to seek and strategize for a better world. These people persist, they are creative, and sometimes they're victorious. The scholar Catherine McKittrick writes about something that she calls the geographical imperatives in the struggle for social justice. The geographical imperatives in the struggle for social justice. So following her line of thinking, this book looks at the role of place and geography in understanding justice and asks how communities have reshaped the bounds of justice over time. So throughout the book, we come back to the idea that investigations into the two-way relationship between people and place, people and the geographies that make them and shape them, matter deeply for dreaming a new future. The late, great Toni Morrison writes about this sort of work through the metaphor of mapping. She wrote, "I want to draw a map, so to speak, of a critical geography and use that map to open up as much space for discovery, intellectual adventure, and close exploration, as did the original charting of the New World, but without the mandate for conquest." I love that quote, and this is an approach that we try to emulate here in this book. Detailed mapping and exploration without trying to own or to conquer. We're all guests here. So what kind of Bay Area do we reveal in the book? To help answer that, I want to share a quote. This is from one of our interviews with activist and community leader Tanya Lee. She told me, when people think about the Bay Area bubble, they're often thinking more about the hippies in Berkeley rather than the communists in Chinatown, the Marxists in Oakland who started the Black Panther Party, or the feminists of color who created all kinds of local institutions in the 1980s. These stories give us a window into what kind of leadership and struggle are required for transformation of the whole country. And so this gives you a sense that what we're trying to do, we talk about many of the sites that we write about are places that you've heard of, events that you've heard of, but we try to talk about them in slightly different ways than you may have heard before. And then some of the sites we talk about are places that don't usually make their way into guidebooks. And so since I have the opportunity to share space today with LisaRuth, we're going to turn first to San Francisco, where she contributed, I think it was 7 sites, really great stuff. And she will take it away from here for a little bit, and then I'll be back. And so here's the San Francisco chapter map to start you off, LisaRuth.
Thanks, Rachel. Let me just turn my heater off here. So first of all, I just want to say that I have very much appreciated the opportunity and the invitation to be a contributor to this book. Because of so many of the things that Rachel just highlighted, it's such a collaborative effort of historians. It's not just one person's take on what they think is interesting about San Francisco or in the region. It's the effort not only of historians and geographers, but those who have worked for social justice over the decades, who contributed sites, information on sites on their own, and as Rachel also mentioned, their oral history contributions as well. So it's mixed up with a perspective that comes from the people. It's a people's guide, and it really does ring true to that title. And it's such a smart review of the intersectional forces of change in our region. So Rachel and I first worked together over a decade ago when Chris Carlson and I edited 10 Years That Shook the City, San Francisco, 1968 to 1978. And Rachel contributed a really great piece on the Western edition to that book. And so here we are again, a decade later, working on San Francisco and regional history. And we also worked together I co-taught an urban affairs course at USF of Rachel's, wherein we led students each week on 5-hour thematic walking tours of San Francisco and Oakland. It's right in line with our history together to collaborate and work together in this guidebook. So I'm glad to be presenting with Rachel today. One of the things Rachel wanted me to talk about was why I chose the sites that I did, and they're all mixed up in that long list right now, but I'll be teasing some of them out as we go. But mostly, in my work with Shaping San Francisco and over the last 13, 14 years as a historian of the city, there have been these stories that kind of emerge from my own research, from scouring foundsf.org, our digital archive at Shaping San Francisco, from the public talk series we host. These sometimes small stories that get a little bit buried within the larger, really well-known stories of San Francisco, and that I wanted to learn more about and investigate. And a lot of these have to do with contestation. They're sites where something has been contested. The right to be there, the right to express one's identity, whatever that might be. We're going to get into some of those themes. And some of the sites I chose, I mean, I gave them a really long list to start with, but of course we didn't want to overemphasize San Francisco. And so some of the distilled sites that I was able to talk about were also those close to my own history. So I was able to give some personal perspective, and they have a perspective also of like the evolution of the city that I'm interested in living in. So so there's a very much like, what's the city that I walk, as part of the sites that I wrote about. And also, I was interested in talking about this theme that Rachel alluded to, which is an individual site that speaks to a much larger citywide or region-wide either phenomenon or a movement, where if you zero in on one site, you get actually a networked idea of a process or a decades-long struggle. So those are some of the reasons that I picked what I did. And of course, the contributions I was able to make are not only personal, but they come from over a decade of doing in the field study, administering our digital archive FoundSF, and being a tour guide myself. So one of the things that's been important when developing tours is it's important to scratch the surface a little bit deeper than what I've been presented, what I've learned, what I can see, and what also might be handed down in sort of our common lore. So I hoped with all of these sites that I wrote about to say, okay, there's this level, and then there's this level, and then let's look at this level. And it's not only about time, but it's also about what leads one action to another. And because I lead tours and largely for San Franciscans, and I know there's a couple of you on this call who have been on our Shaping San Francisco tours, but it's not only tourists that come to our city because of the tradition of the counterculture and the political boundary pushing that we're famous for. You know, a lot of tourists might not know where to find those stories, so this is a great resource for them. But those of us who've settled here on unceded Ramaytush Ohlone territory also come in search of a little bit of this magic, of the idealism of changing the world. Like, how are we going to do that, through what means, and how that's sprinkled around the peninsula and the San Francisco Bay Area. So a couple of the sites you can see on that list there that are personal to me are, well, actually they're a little bit wrapped up. When you get the book, you can see some of the things I contributed research to. Alamany Farm is part of a larger network of urban agriculture, the Tenderloin National Forest, and some murals that I worked on with Mona Carone show up in the Tenderloin pieces. The Twitter tax break zone, it's called here on this list. I wrote about Buddhist-oriented hospice projects, having been a caregiver and a staff member at Zen Hospice Project. And we also talk about Maitri, so how those, sorry, I'm just having some, there we go. My computer took over for a second there. So we also, we talk about some sites, how AIDS caregiving and end-of-life care really emerged out of the San Francisco experience of confronting that epidemic. There's a piece about the People's Temple, which, speaking to this idea of a well-known story, but looking for what is it about these stories that is a little bit more special, I guess. And so there's a lot of good recent research around the People's Temple is really a site of Black activism. It gets overlooked in the drama of that large-scale mass murder suicide in Guyana, and the controversy over the leader of the People's Temple, but it really was this sort of vibrant, amazing place of social action. And to look at it without acknowledging the large contribution of the African American community is really doing is really kind of focusing on the wrong place. So it's nice to be able to sort of shift the focus with some of these sites that we've talked about. And finally, just really briefly, some friends of mine have been active around accompaniment of families of Latino men murdered by the police. And so the story of Alex Nieto Park, which is what we're calling Bernal Hill, was something important to tell. And I've been really moved by this trend on social media to check into sites with a sense of renaming them. And Bernal Hill was given this moniker, Alex Nieto Park, in remembrance of the man who was killed there by 45 police bullets because a new resident to the neighborhood was scared of his presence, a man who had lived there his entire life. And so Alex Nieto Park might not be known as a place to go, but it definitely is marked with a remembrance of Alex Nieto still, and a permanent memorial is being is in the works still. But I really want to zero in on 4 sites in particular, and so Rachel, you can move on to the next slide. The first couple are ones that we visit on various Shaping San Francisco walking tours. We do cover a lot of South of Market history. And so I talk about the South of Market block between 4th and 5th Streets and Folsom and Harrison Streets, bearing Filipinas names. And you might know these streets as Mabini, Lapu-Lapu, and some other probably maybe unknown to you historical names, but really important names within the Filipino independence struggle. And this might seem out of place to some people who don't know Filipino independence history. It's not something that happened in San Francisco, except for it did, in the sense that when redevelopment was realigning streets and blocks throughout the South of Market neighborhood, the community that was part of the group of people who were affected by these changes was the Filipino community. And so in the community organizing that happened to contest the city's big plans that really wouldn't take residents into consideration, the Filipino organizers were also some of those advocating for housing, advocating for right of return when they lost their SRO hotel rooms. And so when the streets were realigned and when housing was built that accommodated affordable housing, still, this is a much larger fight than I'm able to talk about right now, so it's sort of hard to be brief about it. But when that happened, there was the ability to pay homage to Filipino political leaders. And this image is from a mural that is on Lapu-Lapu Street, and it was painted by a San Franciscan who was born in the Philippines, Joanna Potig. And it goes through a lot of the Filipino struggle and history and the major figures that some of whom are named in the streets and some of whom are just depicted in the mural. And I think what's really exciting about this block is it's a little bit hidden. If you don't have to go through there, you don't really know it, but it is the site of residence for a lot of elderly folks who were part of that struggle or who were able to benefit from the struggle of the 1970s redevelopment organizing. So this also is a place that many people moved after the fall of the International Hotel in Manila Town across Market Street. So there's this connection to different histories and also geographies within the city of San Francisco. And it connects a little bit to our next site, South Park, in that the Filipino presence is also really strong on South Park. Now, South Park has a much different sort of origin point. In this lower photo, you can see an 1865 image of South Park, when you could almost, if you look just beyond that little rise at the very top of the landscape of the photo there, that would be a view out to the bay. And now if we think about South Park, it's quite an enclosed area, not just with the surrounding streets and the little park, but there's warehouses all around. There's the Bay Bridge that lands just to the south of it. So you have this area, or to the north of it, sorry. You have this area that was one of the first planned residential developments in San Francisco. It was meant to cater to the wealthy elite of San Francisco. We had a lot of mayors in the city hall that came from South Park. There was something called the South Park accent. And you also have that sort of speculation of what's going to be good for the monetary economic interests of a certain class of people fall apart in a depression in 1855 when the bottom dropped out of the economy here and across the country. So you see this portion in that lower photo of the first quarter of the park. It's divided into these quarters that was developed, and then there's nothing much around the other three sides of the park, and that's due to economic instability. So then you have things like the Second Street cut and different 19th century development episodes in this area that affect the livability of the region. And it's also one of the areas of town where Japanese and other Asian immigrants could settle because there were none of these real estate covenants that would exclude people based on race. And those were written into almost every neighborhood in San Francisco, but South of Market didn't have that written in. And largely too, a lot of the workers on the waterfront were Filipino, were Japanese. We had a Chinese shrimping village just around the corner. So there was a proximity to employment that was important as well. So just on the edge of South Park, you had a portion of what we called Nihonjin Machi, which is Japanese people's town. And there were a lot of factory and warehouse workers who were Japanese men. And then you have the Grand Oriente Filipino Hotel and the Masonic Temple, which was the efforts of a group of Filipino men pooling their resources to buy property in San Francisco when it was impossible for a single Asian American person or person of Asian descent living in the United States to buy property. So you have these remnants of a workaround for a community to settle in a certain area. And across the street from Grand Oriente Filipino Masonic Temple is the Grand Oriente Hotel. And the book shows a really wonderful juxtaposition of the mural in South of Market and then the South Park Grand Oriente Hotel, sort of connecting these geographic areas by community, which I really love how the layout artists and Bruce Reinhardt's photos really sort of conceptualize that connection too. So I also wrote about 2 sites that represent a larger network and story, as we were talking about. And when we look at the Mission Cultural Center for Latino Arts, for those of us in the Mission District, it's kind of just one of those things that's always been there. It's this great center of culture and dance and art and vibrancy and performances, but it was only one piece of a much larger project called the Neighborhood Arts Program. So when I talk about the Mission Cultural Center for Latino Arts, we're interested in what that building's history is before it was the Cultural Center. We're interested in who created that, or who has been continuing to continue that legacy. But it comes out of a really particular specific moment in time of the Neighborhood Arts Program in the late 60s and the early 70s, when there was federal funding called the Comprehensive Employment Training Act to do basically job skill training. And what ended up happening was during the Summer of Love and these gatherings of cultural events, they were happening not just in Golden Gate Park and the Panhandle, but they were happening in neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods started taking this momentum of gathering together and brought it into arts programs in schools, artists being paid to teach workshops and skill building. You still have the graphic arts workshop in the city, but you also have the graphic screen printing workshop in the MCC LA, the Mission Cultural Center, which is a vestige of that time. And a lot of artists whose names we know got their start in the Neighborhood Arts Program. Renee Yanez, Ruth Asawa sat on the Arts Commission when this program was being started. So there's a lot of ways where we might not have a household name of the Neighborhood Arts Program, but it gave rise to other places like SOMARTS, the Presida Center, Cultural Center, and also the African American Arts and Culture Complex today, which still exists as part of this legacy as well. And I'm not sure about my time, but I'm going to just do one more spot, and that's the Other Avenues food store cooperative. And so this was kind of a great site because it gave us a location out in the sunset, which was really great to be able to add this connected story to sites that we know well and that are more centrally located, like Rainbow Grocery. The veritable vegetable warehouse is part of this longer history of the people's food system, which then goes back before that to the food conspiracies that came out of the communal household network in San Francisco in the late 60s and the early 70s, a way to get food distributed amongst these households in a very low-cost way, starting to look at organic foods and starting to look at relationship to where food came from. People pooled their food stamps, they pooled their labor, and out of these efforts to, put a bunch of tofu and oats and apples in garages and then distribute it to this network, came a several year-long project of this newsletter called Turnover of the People's Food System. Came out a dozen different food stores, which were cooperatively run, usually volunteer run at the beginning. And this network served the entire city with a focus on giving employment to recent immigrants and recent prisoners who were released from prison. And so there was a thought of support behind it, not just for the communards, but also for a much larger purpose. And so when you go to Other Avenues and you go to Rainbow and you can buy bulk, that seems really wonderful and convenient. And it comes out of a much longer political agenda of getting food to the people. So that pretty much wraps up the places that I want to talk about. And I think Rachel's going to give us a little bit more of a deep dive or an overview of other San Francisco sites.
Indeed. I am. Thank you so much. It's great to hear these stories, and also some of these images, the ephemera pieces, are new to me, and so it's fun to add them in here. And I am going to. We don't have that much time left, but I have a lot of photos I'd love to show you all. So I'm going to kind of dance through them pretty quickly, stop and tell just a couple of stories, and just get you kind of a good dose of the rest of the book. So within the city of San Francisco, it was very important to us to cover, particularly in the context of the blackout migration, it was very important for us to cover some of the key touchstones in African American history and kind of think about what it means for Black futures. And so some of these include the Hunters Point Shipyard. Very nearby, we talk about the lesser known Westbrook Court and Hunters Point Hill street names. I can tell you that story later. I'm working on a book related to Eloise Westbrook's life, and she's the woman who this very short street is named after. We talk about KPOO Radio over in the Western Edition. We, on a different theme, cover the Trans March as a place. We think about its role in placemaking and policymaking, both. And we cover the Civic Center and the UN Plaza area, which is, of course, as you know, a place that you would find in many guidebooks, but we talk about it particularly as a site of surveillance and power, and as a site of collective shelter making for people without homes in San Francisco. And we think about the history of kind of their use of that space. So it's a little bit of a different take on the Civic Center. Over in the East Bay, here's the East Bay chapter map again, just to remind you of the scope, but I'm gonna leap past it really quickly and get to the pictures. So this is the Middle Harbor Shoreline Park, where we tell the story of the economic power of the Port of Oakland, which is right next door. And I think I've got an image, yes, from the drone camera. And we nearby talk about the 1500 block of Adeline. And we use this block as an example of community resilience and struggle, and also corporate power. So we tell the story of foreclosure and powerful resistance back in 2008. This is, of course, the same neighborhood where years before the Black Panthers and years before that, the Pullman Porters were based, and is the same place within a couple of blocks where the Moms for Housing protest won back a house for houseless mothers last year. And so we, sorry about that flip of the slide. So we think about it as a place of activist legacies and community struggle across time. We tell the story of various general strikes, and one of them is in Latham Square, downtown Oakland, the Oakland General Strike of 1945, which we were particularly interested in because it was centered around women's labor in the retail district of downtown Oakland. So all of those beautiful old Art Deco buildings that people love to look at when they're in downtown Oakland. When I see them, I think about labor struggle and the kind of period where women were coming into a different relationship with the rest of the society. And one of these moments happens through the general strike, which centered around their work. And this is a image, historical photo, obviously in front of Conn's, which is now the Rotunda building. So it's an office building now. Also in the East Bay, we talk about the Francis Albright Community Center. And I was thinking of telling a longer story here, but I think I'm going to keep going quickly. And then if any of these sites you'd like to hear more about, please ask or buy the book or email me later. So lots of ways to get the full story. But this is a site where we talk about the formation of a community, South Berkeley, and the extraordinary life of Frances Albright, and the way that through both ordinary and extraordinary coalitions with other people, she actually changes the landscape and changes the scope of possibility for other people like her. She's the first African-American, for example, to run for city council in the city of Berkeley in 1938. She doesn't win, but there's a series of other things that she does in her life that open political and social space. So on a very different theme, we talk about 924 Gilman, which is a subcultural music venue made for a particular kind of rebellious youth. You'll note the sign says no drugs and also no racism and no misogyny and other things. In a very different vein from this, we write about a section of the East Bay. This is around the cities of Richmond and San Pablo, and we call it the Fossil Fuel Corridor. Pretty dark retitling of that neighborhood, but this is our way of thinking about the contradictory impacts of the oil refineries in that area, and the tensions between the need for jobs and the need for environmental safety, and we're all living with that day to day. Elsewhere in the book, these are a different type of site. We talk about the Piedmont-Oakland border, which is heavily watched by surveillance cameras, which you can see in the picture on the left. These are meant to capture license plate numbers when people are speeding through a red light or something like that. But the author of this piece, Will Payne, makes the argument that they represent essentially an invisible fence between the cities of Piedmont and Oakland. As you probably know, Piedmont is fully surrounded by Oakland and has not been interested historically in merging economically, and Piedmont is a much wealthier city than the city of Oakland, and so there are all sorts of issues there. And so that boundary has a race and class significance. We write about the Intertribal Friendship House, which is one of several places that we use to think about the Bay Area as a long-standing site of Native American life from pre-conquest through contemporary times and again into the future. The South Bay is a fascinating chapter that I'm finding a lot of people who kind of know San Francisco pretty well have been like, whoa, had no idea all these interesting things have been going on in the South Bay, and that also that you can find all over the place these sort of sites of political struggle, social struggle, historically and ongoing. So one of my favorite sites, it's actually one of my favorite kinds of People's Guide sites, because this is a place where you can think about how the vernacular or the everyday landscapes of our lives don't always reveal radical histories, but those histories may well be there. And so this is a bridge that connects the city, oops, sorry, I went too far, the city of Santa Clara to the former city of Alviso. Alviso is a fascinating place to visit in its own right. It's small, largely Latinx, 75% of the population there, a population of 2,000, so a very small place, is Latinx. And there's this incredible cluster of 19th century structures. So it's just a fascinating place to walk around and see old industrial buildings, cottages clearly from the 19th century, all throughout its historic urban core. All of this is in very stark contrast to the San Jose that you see on the other side of the bridge. So on one side of the bridge is Alviso, this old historic town, and on the other side is San Jose. And if you were standing on this bridge, you could turn one way and then turn the other way and see, basically, it feels like you're looking to the past and the future, except it's also the present and the future in both directions. And so it's different experiences. It's really a tale of two cities, is sort of a moment. We tell the story in the book about a action that activists took in the 70s on this bridge. I won't tell the full story right now, but you can see this image from the newspaper clipping where activists were charging cars to drive across to make a statement about the need for more investment in the city of Alviso, which was and continues to be underinvested by the county. So I'm seeing that we're at 5 to 6. I am just going to show you a few other pictures, tell you these stories another day. That's the Tesla factory. And just give you a quick taste of the North Bay before we close. So the North Bay, is an area that a lot of people associate, of course, with nature, and we look at it through that lens, but in a different way. This is a hiking trail. We use it to talk about labor and labor exploitation and landscape exploitation as well. We look at the beautiful Farallon Islands and we think about the problem of toxic waste, but also the beauty. And it was great that we could get some of these photos of the animals out there. China Camp, which I will sum up for you with this one quote. Renee Young, who runs a project that you may have heard of, Chinese Whispers. Check them out if you haven't seen her work. She says, you hear about the railroad, you hear about the mines, you hear about laundry and restaurants, but somehow Chinese maritime history has been a hidden story. And there's a strong relationship between the loss of this history and the loss of the landscapes where these events happened. And so for me, that's a comment that applies both to this particular history and then also to many of the kinds of places that we found important to document in this book. I will give you one more quote before we go. This is the Albany bulb. You may have hiked out there. Fantastic art that's always ever changing on the edge of Albany. And here's a quote from Susan Moffett, who runs Love the Bulb, which takes care of the park there. And she says, the bulb, wait, let me just do a quick scroll. Yeah, she says, the bulb holds up a mirror to the urbanization that has happened around the bay. Everything that got torn up in order to make room for change in the urban fabric got dumped out here. So the bulb used to be a landfill. It's where the waste created in the process of development is made visible. When we build something new, we forget about the old stuff that has to go away, but the chunks of highway and bathroom tile and pieces of rebar sticking out remind us that there is no away. And for me, this quote, of course, it's about the bulb, but again, I hear in this kind of echoes of a sense of understanding of how history is with us. You know, at the Albany bulb, you can really see it sticking out of the earth because it was a landfill. And so kind of remnants of the nearby streets are right there in front of you and get turned into these artworks. But it's, while not all places have such visible remnants of the past, the story of the bulb reflects this kind of larger need that I think we have to excavate and understand what really constitutes the ground that we're standing on. So I see it as a metaphor. How did we get here? Who claimed power along the way? What are the implications of that claiming in the landscape and in our lives? Are we more or less unequal now, and how can we change that for the better? This is a series of questions I'm kind of throwing out at the end here. They're part of the way that I think about the region and about places in general, the kinds of questions that we were trying to answer in this book. Sometimes the answer is in the histories that we walk across every day. Each place has a story. Each story opens up this kind of broad set of questions that can take you in many directions, virtually or literally. So I want to leave you with one more thought and then see if you have any questions, which is, you know, for us collectively working on this book, it really kind of solidified over and over that the ongoing study of the relationship between places and people can teach you a lot about where you are, of course, but also who we are collectively, who we have been, who we are now, and who we can become. We have many options. We can make decisions, and these sites of struggle show us that there are all these moments where people had choices and decided through struggle to build something a little bit different, to try to. And so, as LisaRuth mentioned, these kind of the city that we want to be living in, the world that we want to be a part of, people are right here making it and have been making it. And so those are some of the kinds of things that we're thinking through in this book. And I want to show you one more slide with a whole bunch of information about how you can reach either of us. And with that, say thank you. And I know we don't have lots of time left. I can stick around a little beyond 6 for source if there are questions or comments that people have. And if you want to write those in the chat, or Roberto might have a way to be able to see you raise your hand or something like that, maybe he'll chime in and let us know. But let's see if there's any questions in the chat. Oh, I see one. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for this presentation, for inspiring presentation. It's really beautiful, and like the last quote, I think it's very meaningful. I really hope that this challenging time that we are living right now will push people to create something better for all of us, for this city that we love. And honestly, I've been in San Francisco for 10 years, and just by following your presentation, I've learned many new location and stories that I never heard before. So I look forward to reading the book. And I don't see any, I only see maybe one question on the chat box. Let's see, from Ivan. I was just at the Bulb yesterday and felt compelled to add that the makers of the art got thrown out, or am I mistaken?
I don't totally understand the question. The makers of the art.
Are got thrown out? I don't know in what sense, like maybe.
I mean, so I don't know if Ivan, if you want to clarify, that would be lovely. But in the meantime, I can just say, the Albany Bulb is an ever-changing place. Oh, houseless people live there. Okay, yes. So yes, thrown out. I understand. Okay, yes. So the history of the Albany Bulb is that it was a landfill for a long time, and then it was essentially an untended public park and became home to quite a few people who didn't have housing. And they were part of the process of turning it into this artscape. And that's what I think Yvonne is referring to. And yes, there were several cycles of evictions that took place, and they would be evicted and then they would come back multiple times over the years. But it's really now been quite a while since houseless folks have been able to kind of remain, and so they have the city of Albany has become much more strict about maintaining the park as a park and not a place for people to stay overnight. And it also has become a formal part of the East Bay Regional Park System, and I think that formality was part of the one of the triggers for clearing folks away, which is, and so there are people living just nearby by the freeway, because of course we haven't solved the problem that forced them to seek shelter out on the Bulb. But so the Bulb has this very powerful art history that is entwined with some of the artists were houseless and lived out there. Some of the artists were other people living nearby across the region who were just interested in working with the materials out there.
And if people want to learn a lot more about it, the podcast East Bay Yesterday has a really great, I think, 2-part series on the Albany Bulb and its early podcast episodes. So check out East Bay Yesterday if you want to dive into that story or any other East Bay history. It's such a great podcast.
I second that one.
Anyone else that would like to ask a question? Allison, I see that you have your webcam on. Would you like to ask anything? No? Stephen Johnson is writing, many of our visitors to San Francisco are middle class, generally white, and are most interested in seeing places like Golden Gate Park, Fisherman Wharf, etc., etc. Yeah, I agree with that. But this is definitely something that you can always share with people visiting, and they want to learn something different, about the city, and it's also for our own culture experience and cultural knowledge as well, right?
I mean, I think I actually want to challenge that a little bit, because I myself moved to San Francisco over 25 years ago now, for this express purpose that there had been people pushing the envelope around politics and culture and sexuality and identity for a really long time. And I think that a lot of San Franciscan tourists who come to San Francisco, they may appear and definitely want to see the main things, and may appear that they're of a sort of homogenous group, but I think there's a little bit in each of those people that's like, I want to dig into San Francisco's aura in a way, and whether that's city lights and banned books and Lawrence Ferlinghetti's legacy, or whether that's learning about the Peace Navy and the way that the Bay has been a place to protest wars, or whether that's learning about the free Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, or the free food, or the food conspiracy. I think those stories still appeal to people because San Francisco does carry that ethos. So don't sell your tourists short.
And I would add to that, people are interested in what they know to be interested in sometimes, you know, if they don't know what else is out there. But I would also say that I would love to take a group of tourists to do a people's guide version of the stories of Golden Gate Park and Fisherman's Wharf. If I were out at Fisherman's Wharf, and you know, this is an example, we didn't write about it in the book, but I've often used that as an example of a place that would be really interesting to do a people's guide take on. What are the labor struggles that have produced this place that is now, you know, it's largely centered around the tourist economy? You could ask questions about what's happening. Who are the workers there now? What are they getting paid? How do they feel about their lives in their city? How do they relate to the tourist economy? You could go back in time and think about the production of the place over time. You could go pretty far back in time and look at, you know, what was that part of the peninsula? What did it represent for Native American communities that were here? Was it a site? You know, there are lots of different questions you could ask. So I guess there's both of those things. LisaRuth's point about there are all these other stories that people may want to know or may not even know they want to know, but would be happy to hear. And we can go to the very same places that that we go to all the time and look for the other stories that aren't always told. There's always a tension in the landscape. It's always there if you look for it.
And specifically for Fisherman's Wharf, the treatment of Italians and Italian Americans during World War II, and how Italians were barred from using their own boats because of the fear of the enemies meeting beyond the Golden Gate, the Japanese and the Italians, and this story, which gets a little bit lost in the racism or the, you know, the fear of the enemy stories of war during that World War. We're learning more, and thank goodness, about the Japanese incarceration, but Germans and Italians also had a very difficult time. And so, you know, those kinds of stories and filtering those into the common lore is, I think, really helpful for a broader perspective.
Definitely, yes. And Allison is adding to this point, saying many of the readers of this book may be solo travelers that we don't encounter in groups. But this is a growing theme, so walking tour customers will appreciate this other side of the classic places for sure. Mm-hmm. I agree. And it's, in the end, we are kind of, you know, the tour guides are the educators, so on San Francisco or the East Bay. So it's up to us to share those stories, and I'm sure by reading this book we'll be able to learn a lot of these interesting stories that they're not so famous as like the you know, Pier 39 or Golden Gate Park or Golden Gate Bridge, but there's a lot to know about San Francisco. Personally, I'm always learning, and with that, I thank you again for this presentation. I just posted the link on the chat box for those of you that are interested to purchase the book or additional information. I will also share Lisa and Rachel information tomorrow on my feedback email with a recording, and so you can connect with them if you like. And if there's no other questions, I will say goodbye. We thank you again for being with us tonight. Thank you again, Lisa and Rachel, for your beautiful presentation. And see you soon.
Thank you so much for inviting us, for hosting us. It's terrific.
Thanks to Anita Rao for suggesting this in the first place. We really appreciate that.
I forgot to mention Anita. Yeah, she created the connection, as always does. She's a great connector. Okay, have a good night, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks, Rachel.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.